One of the behaviors that primates engage in regularly, particularly when they're incredibly social, is that of communication. Communication is defined as any act that conveys information in the form of a message to another individual. And what frequently happens when things are communicated is that the recipient of the message may change their behavior. And this may be either deliberate or unintentional. So, communication can include autonomic, or what are also called physiological or involuntary responses. This can include things like scent, your gait. Are you briskly walking away versus running versus casually meandering? Also, pileoerection is pretty common among primates. We have it too as humans. We call them goosebumps. Pileoerection is when there's been something that stimulated your hair to stand up. And so this can be cold, of course, but this can also be a fear response. And one of the things that pileoerection does in animals, including non-human primates that have quote unquote fur coats, is that it makes you look bigger. So you can kind of have a bigger, like an air of confidence, or be a little more intimidating by having all of your hair stand up on end. Um, but it can also include intentional communication, such as gestures, facial expressions, and vocalizations. There are some common dominant behaviors that are used to reinforce that dominant position, including prolonged stares, eye contact. Eye contact is a threat in many non-human species. Gorillas are one example of this. If you stare at a gorilla, you're going to make it uncomfortable. And so if you find yourself visiting a zoo, try to remember that, because if you just outright make eye contact with the gorilla, you're often going to see display kinds of behaviors after that, like chest thumping and running and throwing things, etc. So, it's good to have that knowledge of whether eye contact is reassuring or eye contact is intimidating. I mean, even think about yourself, right? When you feel someone staring at you, like you have a physiological response to that. And sometimes that involves getting goosebumps, right? You start to feel uncomfortable or even threatened in that context. Yawns and smiles, particularly those that show canines, are dominant reinforcing behaviors. So smiles we tend to think of as being associated with happiness. And yes, absolutely. You smile when you're happy, when you laugh, etc. But we also use smiles in a fundamentally different way, right? We use smiles as fake signals. Some of us smile or laugh when we're nervous, for example, or if we're trying to promote an air of confidence, we may be more likely to smile, showing all of our teeth. And that harkens back to our non-human primate roots. Branch shaking or somehow manipulating an object in your substrate that makes a whole lot of noise draws attention to you and draws attention to your display behavior, which reinforces to other individuals that you have higher rank than they do. Um, and then mounting. One other dominance behavior that's found quite commonly across non-human primates is that of mounting. And so mounting is when you approach another individual from behind and you place your genital area, your pelvic area, on their rump. And people often assume that this is some kind of signal of sexual behavior. And of course, mounting is going to be involved in sexual behavior, but so many other times, particularly when individuals are doing what we call same-sex mounting, it's to reinforce dominance and subordinates. And so the individual who is allowed to mount, or the individual who is doing the mounting, is the dominant individual, and the subordinate individual accepts that mount or demonstrates appeasement or subordinate gestures. So this is used to explain some of what's been interpreted as homosexuality among non-human primates. I mean, when we look at species that are really highly dominance oriented, like baboons, there's going to be male-male mounting, but there's also going to be female-female mounting, and it says nothing about the sexuality of the organisms. You can see this in your domesticated dogs. We have a pack that is entirely female right now, but we still see mounting behavior, and it's sometimes accompanied by thrusting behavior, and it has nothing to do with sexuality and sexual pleasure, and everything to do with reinforcing our canine dominance hierarchy. There are some common behaviors that are associated with submission as well, including crouching, putting yourself low to the ground, um, presenting the hindquarters to be dominance mounted. Sometimes that's accompanied by the individual mounting you. Other times that's accompanied by just a visual inspection of your hindquarters. Hugging and grooming behaviors also help to reinforce amicable relationships, help to appease and kind of mitigate aggression and reassure other individuals that they are, in fact, still dominant to you. And so then the display behaviors that can include aggressive behaviors like grimacing, like open mouth threats, like chest thumping, like throwing things, like shaking things that make a loud noise. All of those are forms of communication too. And so on this slide, we have a few pictures. We have an adult female chimpanzee who's screaming at another female. That other female is pulling at her food. That screaming it's a fear scream. It's a way of communicating to that other female basically that, I'm sorry, I didn't know you wanted this food. Please don't hurt me. And among common chimpanzees, there is an awful lot of feeding competition between females, particularly for coveted resources. So this kind of conflict and response is pretty commonplace. In the middle picture, we've got a juvenile chimpanzee who's showing a play face. The key here is that there's not a grimace. I mean, he's showing his canines, yes, but it's not in a grimace or a threatening manner. He's showing his canines in such a way that he's kind of doing a relaxed kind of sort of laughing sound. And, we see this among dogs. We see play bowels and play growls that are fundamentally different from those aggressive growls. And so just like with our domesticated house pets, we can look to cues through body posturing, the sounds that animals are making, etc., as to what their intent is with the facial expression they're making. The third one here is a Tibetan macaque that's baring his teeth, grinning to signal submission to a dominant. So one of the differences between kind of the dominant's open mouth threat and this grin of submission is that the dominant is going to not just pull the lips back, but also physically open his mouth as though he's going to bite. And so that open mouth threat is considered reinforcing dominant behavior, while the grin, with the eyebrows raised that shows the whites of the top lid, that is associated with signaling submission. So, smiles are not something that are always friendly, that are always conveying a desire to have affiliative interactions. When we talk about kind of the style of behaviors, we dichotomize aggressive interactions from those that are affiliative. Aggressive behaviors lead to group disruption, and they often arise out of competition to key critical resources that can include things like mating partners and access to food. There are different reasons for aggression within the group, or intergroup aggression, and aggression between groups, or intergroup aggression. Intragroup aggression generally isn't going to result in fighting. It's going to be kind of mediated through displays and other signals. So a lot of those appeasement gestures and dominance gestures that we were talking about, those are going to be the kinds of things you use with your group mates, because if every competitive interaction within the group was to be mitigated by fighting, we'd have really high risks and rates of injury and that we call morbidity. We'd have higher rates of mortality where animals would outright die from those fights. So having systems of behaviors in place that reinforce the dominance hierarchy but mitigate the aggression can be incredibly beneficial to the group. So it's often then resolved with these submission or appeasement behaviors. So if we're talking about baboons, I might open mouth threat at you. You might flash your eyelids to show me the whites of your eyelids to signal that, yes, I received your threat. I'm not going to do anything to escalate the situation. I'm appeasing you. That might be followed by you coming over and grooming me, which is going to be kind of that ultimate appeasement gesture, right? That you're going to give me some kind of beneficial social interaction that's going to kind of lead to a cascade of hormones that's going to be more feel good and affiliation hormones versus those that rise with increased aggression. The intergroup or between group aggression is often over territoriality and protecting resources. So you might be protecting your territory, you might be protecting certain food resources, you may even be competitively excluding other individuals from your reproductive females. And this intergroup aggression can often be lethal. We find lethal intergroup aggression among primates that are as far apart as chimpanzees, red colobus monkeys, spider monkeys, and capuchin monkeys. Chimpanzees, of course, common chimps have been documented patrolling territorial boundaries and kind of going on reconnaissance and kind of search and destroy missions, whereby if they find a solitary member of another group, they will just outright kill them, not to eat them, but just as a message, as a way to minimize that other group's competitive ability. Territoriality can also be associated with ranges that are small enough to patrol. And so this is what we see among gibbons, siamangs, and vervet monkeys, is that they have smaller territories. Thusly, it matters more that they competitively exclude others from those territories. For gibbons and siamangs, it's a monogamous pair that is competitively excluding others from that breeding territory. So patrols may be somewhat regular and help to reinforce those territory boundaries. And so here we have a sequence of two images showing chimpanzee territoriality. In the first image, you see an unrelated male who's not a member of that group showing a fear grin as a result of being challenged by some members of another group of chimpanzees. That fear grin then is not enough because it's intergroup aggression to minimize the kind of brutal nature of that interaction. And so as a result, there's going to be outright escalation and then fighting and punishing. And this eventually led to the death of the chimp who's pictured on the ground in the second image. So these chimp attacks can be quite brutal. And there have been books written, one of them, and I'm trying to remember whether it was Frans de Waal that wrote it, or whether it was Richard Wrangham. There was a book called Demonic Males that talks about kind of the non-human primate origins of aggression among male humans and kind of equating common chimps to some of the outright warfare that we see among human societies. We also, though, see affiliative behaviors. These help to lead to group cohesion. They can include things like reconciliation after a fight, consolation after something is lost, and simple amicable interactions between family and friends. These appeasement gestures, these reconciliation behaviors, often involve physical contact. So this can include just touching and kind of reassurance through touch. It can include holding hands, hugging, even kissing. It certainly extends to what we call grooming behaviors. And so when these affiliative kinds of behaviors were first viewed by primatologists, a debate was opened up as to whether non-human primates have what we consider empathy in humans. Empathy is defined as the ability to identify with the thoughts and feelings of another individual. This has been addressed in psychology with a concept called theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to recognize that others may possess mental states that are different from yours. And so the general consensus is that apes have theory of mind. Very social monkeys do, not all monkeys do. Prosimians don't have very well established theory of mind. The typical way that they test for this in animal species is through what's called the red dot experiment, where they will put an individual under anesthesia and then either paint or tattoo a red dot on their forehead. And then when the individual wakes up, they are presented with a mirror. If they aggressively interact with that mirror, they don't recognize that the individual in the mirror is themselves. If they end up instead inspecting their own bodies through that mirror, like touching their forehead where the red dot now resides, then They are presumed to have theory of mind, to be able to recognize themselves in the mirror, to be able to recognize that other individuals have different mental states. This ability to recognize other individuals' mental states is then associated with deception. And so to be able to deceive other individuals, you have to recognize what it is that other individuals are thinking. And we do know that baboons are capable of deceit. Capuchins and spider monkeys are capable of deceit. Some macaques are capable of deceit. Great apes are certainly capable of deceit. So interesting stuff that's done kind of in the field of what we call primate cognition is often done through psychology departments rather than anthropology departments. But many of the aspects that are associated with modern day kind of social intelligence are present at least in some of our non-human primate ancestors or relatives, and bear up under laboratory experimentation, but then may not always be visible in wild behavior. Grooming is one of the most consistently important behaviors that's exhibited by primates, and it is considered affiliative in nature. Grooming involves using the fingers or the teeth to pick through the fur of another individual. You can also self-groom, which is called allo-grooming. What grooming does from a functional standpoint is it removes dirt, insects, and other materials. So it does serve a hygiene function, particularly when there are high loads of what we call ectoparasites, lice, mites, other things like that. Grooming can be associated with receiving regular grooming can be associated with better health, but it's also immensely pleasurable. And so oftentimes the degree with which primates groom one another is not, it's more than just what helps with removal of ectoparasites. They groom each other much more frequently than would be necessary just for the health functioning. So it's a frequent rest time behavior across many primates. Grooming, particularly the act of being groomed, is associated with a cascade of hormones that we typically consider pleasure hormones, things like oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine. And thusly, grooming can reinforce social bonds, and we see it in a variety of contexts. Mothers often groom their infants, and sometimes in captive settings, we even see over-grooming of infants. Some mothers are so kind of good at grooming that they will pick the hair off of their infants and render them bald. And as infants age, then this typically goes away because they spend less time in proximity to their mothers. Males will groom sexually receptive females, and so in this context, it's a social bond that hopes to gain access into reproductive opportunities. And so by willingly grooming females who are in estrus, you raise the likelihood as a male that any one of those females that you groom might possibly allow you to mate with them. We find among Cercopithecines in particular behaviors that we call consortship, where when a female is in estrus, and the reason that we pointed out among Cercopithecines, the baboons and macaques, is because they have those reliable visible indicators of what's going on hormonally. So both baboons and macaques have estrus swellings that are visible to the naked eye and that reliably signal what's going on hormonally. Chimpanzees also have estrus swellings, but those estrus swellings are not reliable. Those estrus swellings instead conceal ovulation because chimpanzees advertise that they're almost always receptive, and males mate with them correspondingly, but in actuality, on a 35-day cycle, you're not going to be receptive for 30 days. You're only going to be receptive for about 5 days. So these consortships exist when females demonstrate these estrus signals, and then males will follow them around for a period of days in order to secure the right to mate with them. And they're much more likely to mate with males that have spent that time in consort and have actively groomed them during consort. We also see grooming as one of these reconciliation and consolation behaviors. And so subordinate animals will often groom dominant animals. When I was doing my work with baboons, one of the things that I saw frequently was that subordinate adolescent females would groom dominant adult females who had offspring. And really, what they were doing through that grooming behavior, it wasn't even about securing like future social bonds. It was everything about trying to gain access to those infants. And so it wasn't necessarily to try to steal those infants, but adolescent female baboons are pretty obsessed with infants, and it's almost like it's their opportunity to learn some of their nurturing behaviors by being allowed to interact with the infants of more experienced mothers. And so by engaging in these grooming bouts, they get closer to the infants and are more likely to then be able to groom the infant themselves, or be able to somehow otherwise interact with the infant. Grooming also provides reassurance during tense situations and restores peaceful relationships. Now, we talked about the various great apes with last week's module, and we specifically talked about the differences between common chimpanzees and bonobos. What bonobos engage in through their sexual behavior also fills this same kind of role that grooming does. And so it's a reassuring behavior, it's consolation, it's a way to forgive one another, to offer up your apology if you've transgressed. And so that affiliation that comes through grooming and physical contact can also extend to sexual behavior. I mean, we even have a phrase for it among modern humans. We call it makeup sex, right? Which is supposed to be the sex that you have after you've had some kind of disagreement with your partner. And to believe some people in social media, makeup sex is supposed to be some of the best sex. Whether it is or isn't, it's the similar sort of behavior that bonobos are engaging in. Things that are pleasurable, be it grooming, be it sex, can help to kind of stop that cascade of cortisol and testosterone production that leads to aggression, and trigger that cascade of oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine that just cause everybody to relax and kind of peace out, and thusly can help to facilitate group cohesion rather than group disruption. And so here we show a variety of non-human primates engaging in grooming. The first picture is between baboons. The top right picture is between rhesus macaques. The individuals here in the rhesus macaque picture, you see an individual grooming an infant. That infant is not their own infant. That infant is in fact the offspring of the female being groomed right beside them. So if you're able to see the arrow here, this is the dominant female. This is the dominant female's infant. What these two females have done is approach the female and started out by grooming her to gain access then to eventually groom her infant right here. And then down here, we've got wolf squenins that are also engaging in grooming. And so here we've got a female and her offspring, both of whom are grooming the dominant male. So with affiliative behaviors comes this idea of altruism. Altruism is a behavior that you engage in that is at a cost to yourself in order to confer a benefit to another individual. And so we call this selfless behavior. We talk about altruism among humans and talk about things like donating to philanthropy, donating to charitable organizations, or feeding the homeless, or organ donation, or things like that. Altruism among animals is not quite a synonym of cooperation, but a lot of the behaviors that invoked altruism as an explanation for them are now considered cooperative behaviors that occur due to some other function. So we'll talk briefly here about the evolution of cooperation, or the explanations of cooperation. Cooperation can occur because of mutualism. This is when both individuals get a net benefit from helping one another. And so the sharks and cleaner fish are a textbook example of mutualism. The shark gets better dental hygiene. The cleaner fish gets kind of a free meal. The reason the shark doesn't eat the cleaner fish is because the shark is also getting this mutual benefit. There are Some species of monkeys that will form even cross-species alliances, where two monkey species will come together to forage because the actions of one increase the foraging success of the other and vice versa. Diana monkeys are often found in multi-species groupings because they are one of the species that realize increased feeding success if they pair with other species of monkeys. Another explanation for cooperative or prosocial behavior is that of kin selection. This states that due to a high degree of genetic relatedness, the cost of the donor is minimized. And so we recognize that relatives share a proportion of their genes. We can call this inclusive fitness. That's the proportion of genetic material that you share with another individual due to common descent. And so among full siblings and parent offspring, we see a high degree of relatedness where half of the genes are shared. Among half siblings and grandparents and aunts to nieces and nephews, we see a quarter of your genes shared. Among cousins, we see an eighth of your genes shared, so on and so forth. And so primates are very likely to cooperate with their kin. There was a great experiment done by Cheney and Seyfarth with vervet monkeys that looked at the likelihood of responding in a situation where alliance aid was needed. And there were two kinds of rules of thumb. The first of those was that if you hear your relatives make a distress call, then you respond to that distress call. The second kind of relationship is this third bullet point, reciprocity, that we can form long-term alliances where individuals exchange roles non-simultaneously, so that sometimes you are the donor and sometimes you are the recipient. And one of the things that Cheney and Seyfarth found with their vervet monkeys was that if someone groomed you recently, then if you hear them make a distress call, you go to their aid. So that payback isn't necessarily at exactly the same time and not exactly in the same currency. Going to their aid is different than just going back and grooming them, but that these affiliative kinds of behaviors occur to help cement these long-term alliances. And so we're more likely to find reciprocity or reciprocal altruism in species that have really long lifespans and really low dispersal rates. So elephants reciprocate with one another. Vampire bats, interestingly, reciprocate with one another. They do it through regurgitating blood, so it's a food sharing behavior. And it's one of the things we talk about in the Human Life course is how roosting together a lot basically is a signal of friendship, but helps to mediate that food sharing behavior among vampire bats. Baboons engage in reciprocal relationships. Chimpanzees engage in reciprocal relationships. Capuchins and spider monkeys engage in reciprocal relationships. So, and humans, of course, engage in reciprocal relationships. So, when we look at some of the examples of cooperation that we see among non-human primates, we find some that fit the bill here with reciprocity. For example, chimpanzees cooperatively hunt red colobus monkeys. That's what's pictured in the picture here on the right. This is what happens after a kill. So when chimpanzees cooperatively hunt red colobus monkeys, they serve different roles in the hunt. Some of those males climb trees in a manner where they can't be seen so that they can jump out and kind of flush out the monkeys. Some of those males climb trees in a very kind of public way so that they are visible to the monkeys and kind of cut off those routes of defense or routes of escape. After the hunt is completed, we've got rules about food sharing. And so first you share with those males that cooperated in the hunt with you. Secondly, you share with those males that are your alliance partners but didn't cooperate in the hunt. Thirdly, you share with females that you probably want to have sex with or have long-term friendships with. We also see adoption of infants among primate groups, though it's very rare that you see adoption of unrelated infants. Usually those infants are those of someone else in your kinship group. So an aunt may may adopt her niece, or a grandmother may adopt her grand offspring. Correspondingly, even in human groups, we see a lot of adoption among Melanesia and Polynesian islands, but most of those adoptions happen at a kinship level and serve to equalize the dependency ratio. So it may be an older sister who, after her kids are grown, adopts a few of her younger siblings' offspring to kind of reduce that burden of provisioning on her younger sibling. Uh, when we adopt related individuals, we're not bearing the full cost of what we would consider unrelated adoption. And then we also, among baboons, see reciprocity and alliance formation. We also see friendship between male and female baboons. That is, males have some females they hang out with even when they're not nestrous. And when they're with them, they're not looking for sex. They just like each other's company. They groom one another reciprocally. They feed together, so on and so forth. So, a lot of what we would bill as altruism among both non-human primates and among humans is really under the guise of one of these other relationships, most often kin selection and